So there were 2 or 3 comments about why didn't you guys use SteamOS? Why didn't you guys use SteamOS on our Steam Machine Killer? I'm just gonna be calling it the J Machine just to make it easier in this video. But in this video, I'm gonna break down why we went with Bazzite, how modern gaming Linux distros are kind of built and put together, and why the differences between Bazzite and SteamOS aren't really as important as you would think. I went ahead and installed the latest SteamOS 3.8 point whatever, and tested it, ran a couple benchmarks to see if there were any performance differences, and I'll talk about the user experience differences if there were any. So let's get right into it. So why'd we go with Bazzite instead of SteamOS on this machine? I mean, honestly, it was mainly just because I knew Bazzite had broader hardware support, even though we technically didn't need it because it's an all AMD system. That, Jay's familiarity with Bazzite already, plus the fact that it has a lot more options for configuring in case we wanted to like install Windows on the same machine. Bazzite supports dual boot out of the box, whereas SteamOS doesn't. And Bazzite supports more hardware, like this Intel Arc-powered handheld that I have. So that's kind of why we went with it. I mean, it was just like, it was already a known, good working system that we knew how to set up. We already had the image laying around on the on our Ventoy install disk, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we went with Bazzite originally in the video that we built this system in. But like I said earlier in the intro, I did install SteamOS on this and have been running a few tests back and forth between Bazzite and SteamOS to see if there were any differences in performance or user experience, et cetera, et cetera. But at first, let's take a step back and then kind of talk about how modern gaming Linux distributions are actually kind of built, how the software stack is like layered on top of each other. Okay, so let's just start with SteamOS. So we're gonna take a look at this from kind of the top down. So we'll start with the game. Obviously your game runs and it's expecting Windows, which is the first hurdle about running a game on Linux. The game hooks into Valve's Windows API translation layer called Proton. It doesn't emulate Windows. It takes like, if the game asks for, say, like a Windows sound device, it'll take that, translate it to the proper Linux sound device like system, and then vice versa for all of the API calls. So graphics, sound, input, all of that sort of stuff gets handled by Proton and translates it so that basically the game can access all the things that it would normally access under Windows, but obviously not under Windows. So underneath that game running on Proton, you have the game scope Steam Big Picture Session kind of layer. So every operating system has a compositor which handles the windows and like drawing the windows and putting them together, drawing the contents of each window into the windows, and like, you know, responsible for the final display output of your user interface. Now, because Valve was obviously building SteamOS as a gaming first operating system, especially for something like a Steam Deck, which was, you know, the original kind of use case for this modern version of SteamOS. They made a lot of customizations on this layer because they knew that the only thing that the system had to run was basically the game and the Steam UI. So their compositor is called GameScope, and it's basically just handles Steam UI and the game itself. That's it. That's the only thing that's running on the system when you're gaming anyway. But because GameScope is a gaming-focused compositor that only has to handle the Steam window and the game window, there's a lot less overhead versus, you know, a traditional desktop operating system where the compositor has to be ready for, you know, it might have a use case in which a game is running full screen and that's the only thing it has to handle. Or the game might be running in a window with like other 3D accelerated apps running next to it. And so that sort of stuff, obviously, if the compositor is having to be built to handle all of these different use cases, there's going to be overhead. So we have the game, we got it under Proton, and then we got the GameScope session. So that layer right there is basically everything that you see as a user when you're using SteamOS or Bazzite or Nabara or any other gaming Linux distribution that runs that GameScope session. So again, that's everything that you're going to see and kind of notice. Everything underneath that is pretty much, because of the way Linux is so modular, you can swap that sort of stuff out and it doesn't really affect the user experience as far as like, you know, having it running in Steam gaming mode like this, where it's like a console experience where you're primarily interacting with the computer through Steam Big Picture mode. So in the case of SteamOS, underneath that whole UI layer is basically Valve's custom version of Arch Linux. Now, Arch Linux is a really good choice from Valve because Arch Linux is a very modular, very intended for you to customize it exactly the way that you want to use it on the hardware. And so for Valve, being a system integrator and kind of building their handheld and now the Steam machine from the ground up, that was a great choice for them because they could do whatever they want. So what they did was they implemented dual redundant operating system partitions that are also read-only. So you as the user can't really easily screw up anything in the Linux system. And believe me, letting just a random normal user access the underlying subsystems in a Linux system is just asking for trouble, because it is really easy to bork stuff in Linux. Again, because of the open nature of the operating system and just kind of the design philosophies and stuff. So with the dual redundant read-only OS partitions, obviously Valve had to customize their own software and OS update system as well. They also provide you KDE for your desktop environment. So in Windows, you would just call that Windows Explorer. You can't exactly change out the desktop experience in Windows. And for people that are new to Linux, that's kind of a weird thing for it to be modular like that. Not necessarily modular in that you can switch DEs after you've installed the system, but just the idea that you would have a choice of a desktop experience on top of a choice of your operating system, which is kind of weird because Windows and Mac OS have obviously only included their own respective desktop environments, and they don't include any alternatives because why would they? But over the years, as Linux was developing and the advent of the GUI back in the 90s and the 80s, a bunch of different developers had different ideas on what they wanted, how they wanted their desktop environments to work. So that's kind of the blessing and the curse with Linux, is that you get the choice of desktop environments, but you also have to choose if you're kind of building a distro from the ground up. Now, Valve just included KDE because it is kind of the most Windows-like desktop environment on Linux. I also personally prefer it. GNOME sucks ass now. Fight me in the comments. But and that's coming from a Mac user too. God, I hate GNOME. Anyway, but yeah, Valve does include the KDE desktop environment for kind of normal PC tasks, and that's exactly what you see when you boot into desktop mode. So now we've gone over how SteamOS is kind of built. What's the difference between SteamOS and Bazzite? So basically, like I said earlier, everything that the user sees as far as the user interface and the experience, again, is going to be the same. It's still going to be running a GameScope session of Steam Big Picture. Your games are still going to be running on Proton. So because the user experience is basically the same and it's running on the same technologies, again, Valve open sourced GameScope and Proton. So it's not that it's not like Bazzite's running their own version of GameScope. They're literally running the Valve produced GameScope compositor. That part upwards is basically exactly the same. In fact, that's SteamOS and that's Bazzite. Can you tell? No, not really, because again, the UI layer is exactly the same. Once you get underneath the UI layer, where SteamOS has Arch Linux as its base, Bazzite is built off of a Fedora variant called Fedora Atomic Desktops. Now, Fedora has been a Linux distribution that's been around for years. I mean, my first experience with Fedora was probably during SP1 era. So like Service Pack 1 for Windows XP was when I first started dabbling in Fedora. So it's, again, I don't say that to show off my UNC status. It's more that I'm kind of trying to get across that Red Hat and Fedora has been around for forever. And so that's sort of like long-term maintenance, that sort of, having that big kind of company behind a distribution like that. It allows you to get help for problems or something, if you ever run into any weird quirks or whatever. Obviously the documentation for something like Fedora is going to be a lot more widespread. You're gonna have a lot more people that are, have experiences with that versus SteamOS's super custom Arch Linux version. The reason that Bazzite also went with Fedora Atomic desktops as opposed to just the regular Fedora is that the Atomic desktop variants that Red Hat provides has kind of a similar design philosophy to the way that Valve has customized Arch Linux. So again, you get redundant, read-only OS like system partitions. And because they're redundant, if a software or operating system update happens and it fails to boot for some reason, or the update is just bad or incompatible with your hardware, because it keeps a second redundant version on the previous version of the operating system available, if it fails to boot, then it'll just reboot into the previous version and let you know that the software update failed. God, that seems so nice compared to just anything to do with Windows updates. Now, because Fedora is a more general Linux distribution that Bazzite has chosen to base their GameScope experience on, you also get a little bit more choice. You can pick KDE for your desktop environment, or you can use GNOME, or actually they have a bunch of different Fedora Atomic versions with a bunch of different desktop experiences that like only the super Linux nerds would love. Anyone remember Enlightenment DE? Now, the only quirk about the way Linux does its OS updates is that the graphics drivers are built into the OS, not a separate thing. So like on Windows, how, you know, like when you install a new graphics card, you have to install the new driver or whatever, or you have to update the drivers separately. Under Linux, the graphics drivers are part of the OS package. So they only get updated when the OS package gets updated. That can be a blessing and a curse, mainly because you're just kind of under the whim of whoever is maintaining the distribution. You might have very slight like graphics driver differences between SteamOS and Bazzite. It just depends on whether Valve or Red Hat decided to update their graphics driver package in the OS package first. So now that we know how gaming Linux is kind of built, differences between SteamOS and Bazzite under the hood, pros and cons versus Windows. So the read-only OS thing on both SteamOS and Bazzite is obviously nice for noobs. Of course, if you're gonna be running with the Steam Big Picture kind of setup like this as a couch PC or a handheld, you want everything to have that console-like experience. Again, the operating systems are a lot more streamlined versus Windows. The SteamOS install image is 3.1 gigabytes. Now, you might not have the best performance under Linux versus Windows. When I tested it with an NVIDIA card, I did see a fair amount of performance loss when comparing benchmarks versus Linux and Windows. Again, this is a huge grain of salt because there's so many different things with the rendering pipelines on both operating systems that you can't, like, if I were Steve, I wouldn't say that they would be comparable. And he does say that in all of his Linux videos, is that you can't compare the things, but like I just did a high level kind of like user experience test where I just opened built-in benchmarks from games and then same settings and compared it in Windows and Linux. And yeah, I was seeing a little bit less performance under Linux, but sometimes features like RT or specifically for Intel cards, XeSS either perform significantly worse than they do under Windows or they just aren't available at all. Like Nick was messing around with Pragmata, obviously, as you can tell, on the J machine, and we went to try to enable RT and it wasn't there. Like the option was just grayed out. Even though obviously a 9060 can support RT in Pragmata, just didn't work under Linux. So it's just one of those things that, you know, somebody up the chain, either Valve has to fix it with Proton or AMD has to fix it with their Linux drivers, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, sometimes that just happens. It's one of the downsides about Linux. The flip side to that is if you are running the GameScope session in big picture mode, frame times are a lot more consistent under SteamOS versus Windows. That's always been SteamOS's strong suit with that GameScope compositor, even all the way back to like the original Steam Deck launch. And then obviously, it's free, there's no AI bullshit. And my favorite feature under Linux versus Windows is reliable, quick sleep and resume, even if you're in a game. Yeah, see, it's still running, right? Okay, so let's compare Bazzite versus SteamOS. Bazzite's pros are obviously its wider hardware support. Bazzite officially supports AMD and Intel and NVIDIA GPUs. You can download different versions for which cards you have. The AMD and Intel version basically is the same build, and then the NVIDIA version is a separate one, mainly because
NVIDIA, fuck you.
Along with Bazzite's wider hardware support, it also includes wider handheld hardware support. When you're building a desktop, there's a lot less quirks and specific weird things that you have to have either drivers or software solutions for. Now on a handheld, there's a few big hurdles. Obviously the built-in controller needs to work. They're not standardized, like for example under Steam, you get the quick access menu, et cetera, et cetera. Those buttons aren't present on a standard Xbox controller, so all of these handhelds are running custom controllers, so the OS has to support it. SteamOS will only support the controllers on handhelds that are in their beta support list. So that's ROG Ally, Lenovo Legion Go, and Go S. But the thing is, Bazzite already includes a software called Handheld Daemon, which actually is a third-party software stack that handles controllers, RGBs, and TDP controls and stuff for non-AMD handhelds. So like with this Intel handheld that I have here, I have full control over the GPU and the CPU clock speed, the CPU performance, which cores I prefer, the E cores or the P cores, EPP, all of that sort of stuff that you can configure under Windows. You get the same through Handheld Daemon on that. Whereas if I were to install SteamOS on here, it would probably boot, especially because I've heard that recently with the few latest updates, they did quietly include the Intel driver, even though they didn't mention it on the SteamOS website. So it technically probably would boot on this thing, but I would be lacking all of those TDP controls, I would be lacking RGB control, and who knows if this controller will even work unless I would have to hook up a keyboard and mouse, boot into the desktop version, and then install Handheld Daemon on my own separately, whereas Bazzite already comes with it pre-configured. So it's just it's one of those things that's just included, and it's a super nice to have when you're working with hardware that's outside of Valve's like kind of really narrow supported list. And again, I think the biggest pro of Bazzite for the normal user is going to be native dual boot support with Windows. So all you have to do is resize your Windows partition, and then when you go to install Bazzite, it'll detect that Windows is already on that drive and then handle the partitioning and the configuration of the new bootloader so that you have an option to boot into Windows if you wanted to, as well as Bazzite's latest version and the previous version that you get. That's not an option at all with SteamOS. Now, SteamOS, on the flip side, the install process is stupid easy. It's literally 2 clicks and then I think like one hit, like type Y into terminal and then hit enter. And then that's it. It's done, wait a couple minutes, and then freaking it reboots into SteamOS. But there's no customization, no flexibility with that install thing. It will always use all of the entire NVMe that you have in there. There's a pro in that it's a very simple, just completely idiot-proof install system, especially if you're on fully supported hardware like an all AMD system like this. But again, if you wanted to dual boot Windows, I wouldn't even recommend configuring SteamOS to dual boot with Windows, even though you can because it is still running Grub as the bootloader. I had done this previously when I owned a Steam Deck, and the most annoying part is that every time the SteamOS OS updates, it overwrites the bootloader with, or it overwrites all the bootloader settings with obviously Valve's settings in the OS image. So then you'd have to reconfigure it yourself every time after every update so that you can get back into Windows. Now, Bazzite is not without its disadvantages versus SteamOS, especially on the same exact hardware. It boots a little bit slower. It took about 10 seconds longer to boot on this thing. Gaming performance was slightly better, but also sometimes unchanged in SteamOS versus Bazzite. I mean, we're talking 6 FPS, 130 versus 136 in the Cyberpunk built-in benchmark, 163 versus 159 FPS in Horizon 5, and Black Myth was unchanged. So you can get a little bit more performance, but either way, it's kind of a toss-up. And Bazzite does use a little bit more RAM idling. I mean, if your system is RAM constrained, that might be a thing, but both of them were so much less than Windows by default. Like 2.6 gigabytes was what Bazzite was using idle versus 2.1 on SteamOS, which is hilariously low. I wonder if 5.3 gigabytes, less than half the idle RAM usage of Windows because there's just less crap running in the background. So yeah, with all that being said, I hope that answers your questions about why we ran Bazzite and how it doesn't really matter between Bazzite and SteamOS. It's kind of just, there's just design philosophies between the two operating systems. Like, do you want the choice of running a different DE versus KDE? Or do you want just a stupid, simple, I'm never gonna run any other operating system on this drive, it's just a couch machine box and that's it? SteamOS is gonna be your choice for that sort of stuff, provided you're on the hardware that Valve supports for that sort of stuff. So I think the main takeaway, honestly, we were in such an awesome time to be able to ditch Windows for gaming. Like, that is just the coolest thing to be. Again, like I joked earlier, the only thing that really is kind of ball and chain keeping me to Windows is Adobe at this point for work. On my desktop PC, there's a few little RGB quirks that kind of annoy me about Linux versus Windows, but basically, it's just never been easier to just get rid of Windows, especially if it's been so annoying with, like, the force updates, all the nagging, all the AI crap that they're trying to force down your throats and everything. Like, it's free, it's super lightweight of a solution, and it runs basically all the games that you want it to, besides, anything that requires stupid Windows anti-cheat. So yeah, are any of you guys running Linux on your desktop PCs primarily for gaming? How's your experience been, and what hardware are you running it on? Because I mean, I've been really interested in Bazzite, but I don't really use it if I'm playing games on the Intel Arc handheld natively, because the Arc drivers under Linux are still about 30% slower than Windows in performance, which is really, like, that's, I could like deal with it if it was like 10% or like 5% slower, but 30% is a big difference. Like, that's a whole graphics tier of like whether I can run RT or not on Cyberpunk on the handheld. So yeah, it's I'm hoping for better Intel Arc drivers in Linux in the future. But besides that, yeah, what hardware are you guys running it on, and how's your experience been? That's gonna do it for this video, and as always, thanks for watching.